Robert, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Mike.
Now, you've written about a looming iceberg and our post-pandemic debt risk. Can you give us an idea of the magnitude of this problem?
It refers to the acceleration in public debt as a result of the pandemic, and there are various ways of quantifying that. I will take just one, which is general government gross debt of the federal government and the states and territories combined. And on that basis, we're seeing an increase from about $800 billion in 2019 to a projected $1,750 billion in 2024. So that's an increase of roughly $1 trillion in 5 years. And even the 2019 figure was an increase from the years earlier. So it's a well-established upward trend, but the pandemic has caused it to accelerate. And the paper that you refer to talks about the risks in the future associated with this, including the risk of slower economic growth in the future as a result of this debt burden, less fiscal flexibility for future governments, less capacity to respond to the next crisis, whatever its nature might be. So they are the kinds of things that I'm talking about when I talk about the iceberg.
Some states have had their credit rating downgraded. However, Australia has retained a AAA rating. Now, what will it take for them to change course?
Well, New South Wales and Victoria, which were the remaining AAA rated states in Australia, were downgraded by one notch immediately after their budgets late last year. It's not unusual for these downgrades to not stop at just one. So, you tend to get a series of them. So it would not be surprising if they go further. But I think the rating agencies will just wait a while to see what happens before they take any further action. At the national level, the Commonwealth government is still rated AAA, but attached to that is something called a negative outlook. So in other words, they're saying that they're more likely than not to be downgraded in the future, but there is no certainty to that. And again, the rating agencies will wait and see. I think that what it will take to prevent it from happening would need to be a strong economic rebound continuing, and action by the Commonwealth government to stop the hemorrhaging on the budget of expenditure and the explosion of the deficit. That they will have to show that they are determined to bring all that under control and take us back towards a balanced budget, not necessarily surpluses, but a balanced budget within a reasonable period of time.
Balanced budget's really interesting. Is there such a thing?
Well, there was, as recently as 2018-19, that the Commonwealth government finally, after years and years of struggle and a lot of political heat over the issue and how to get there, they just finally scraped home to, well, it wasn't exactly balanced, but it was so close to it that you could say that it was. So, that was very recent. But from where we are now, it's going to be much harder because the deficit is so much larger than it was back then. And I think it's certainly years away. And ditto at the state level, that they have very large deficits, and any return to balance is years away.
And if the state governments keep locking down, it's going to be even harder. And just in one of the publications today, in fact, they were saying that that international travel may not get back to where it was pre-COVID for 3 years. But you hear on the grapevine in the US, for example, that they're expecting a 6 to 10 year turnaround from where we are now to getting back to normal. So who knows? Look, government policies and not the virus have had a devastating impact on our economy and small businesses. Are you surprised, though, there's such an appetite for lockdowns and border controls?
Well, I am surprised. Of course, that appetite has been fed by the massive monetary and fiscal support that has come from government to soften the blow of the lockdowns. But I am certainly surprised and have been for a long time, going back almost to the beginning of this, almost a year ago. I think that it has a lot to do with exaggerated fears on the part of the Australian population, which have been partly due to things that state government, particularly state government spokesmen have said. I think it's also come about because we in Australia, I think, surprised ourselves by how rapidly the COVID infection numbers dwindled last autumn during the national lockdown, and it was virtually became zero fairly quickly, and I think that people came to think that that was a standard that should be maintained, and I think that is the problem, that we've become boxed in by this unrealistic expectation that we can have a zero COVID standard, that is elimination. If that were to happen, it would come at enormous and unsustainable cost. My only hope is that the vaccines will be the circuit breaker that can get us out of this way of thinking, and that if once the vaccine becomes fairly widely applied, that the fear will dissipate, and that people will accept that there will be a certain incidence of the virus, but that it will be relatively harmless.
Interesting, though, and that's the thought that once we get the vaccine, we can move back to being normal, and not COVID normal. But Safe Work Australia, I'm just doing this from the top of my head here, but they actually said that just because you have the vaccine doesn't mean you can't get COVID and pass it on, which would sort of intimate that, sure, you might get the shot and the jab, but we're still going to have this surprise element out there called COVID running around doing terrible things. And so therefore what may happen is that lockdown still will happen, makes the workplace not safe because of, even though you have the vaccine, according to Safe Work Australia, you can still get COVID. So, just going back to what you're saying, I think there seems to be this urge, a real urge to lock things down. So you wonder, though, Robert, whether it's more than just COVID.
Well, I think what you're saying about Safe Work Australia, I would say that, yes, look, I'm not an expert on the medical aspect of this, but I understand that a certain percentage of those vaccinated can still get COVID, and a certain percentage of those can pass it on. But the issue is how serious are the consequences of that, and as my understanding is that the vaccine greatly reduces the seriousness of it, and that what people are getting is much more like a regular cold or flu. And, we've always lived with that. We've always lived with the cold and flu, and we have to live with it, COVID, if that's what it is. If that's what it is transformed into by the vaccine.
Governments need to stop getting that urge to lock down, because it really doesn't do anything except delay. Look, in another one of your papers, you discuss the need for economic reform to boost growth and productivity, etc. What reform do you think would have been most dramatic, or have the most dramatic impact on growth?
Well, there's no single thing that's going to have a dramatic impact, but we have two tasks on the economic front. One is to restore the economy to its potential, and the other one is to increase its potential. So restoring it to its potential is will largely be a result of removing COVID-19 restrictions on all forms of activity, and also the effects of the monetary and fiscal stimulus that are still in the pipeline coming through. So, and we've already made really great strides back towards potential economic activity. You've seen the unemployment rate drop, and first of all, it did not increase as much as had been feared, and secondly, it has dropped back more rapidly than had been expected. So, and that will hopefully continue. But the second task is to increase our economic potential, and that's more difficult, and that's where the economic reforms that you referred to come in. We have to improve our productivity growth, and this was a problem even before the pandemic. Our potential economic growth rate had diminished and productivity growth had diminished, but the pandemic has just given it another hit and made it a bit worse again. So the task has intensified. As I said, there's no one action that's going to have a dramatic effect. It'll have to be a set of actions, each of which may have a small impact, but when you add it all together, it has a meaningful effect in lifting our potential economic growth. And some of these actions include industrial relations and getting back to real enterprise bargaining, which has fallen away so much, infrastructure development, skill training, reducing business taxation, corporate tax rate particularly. These kinds of things are what I'm talking about, which will, over time, and it takes time, increase our potential economic growth.
I said to some friends of mine, who would ever want to be in government at the moment? I mean, it's been very challenging times, hasn't it, Robert?
Well, yes, and unfortunately, just recently, Scott Morrison said, well, it's not the time for these reforms. We don't have any appetite for it. Our focus is on other things, and that's very unfortunate. And it just puts off what will eventually need to be done.
Would you think, though, this is probably one of the best times to bring in reform and move things along, because it's an ideal opportunity?
Well, that's right. There's the well-known, what has become the well-known saying of "Don't let a crisis go to waste." Yes, a crisis tends to create the atmosphere for doing things like this, which is not, people don't see the need for it if you're in good times, whereas they might be more willing to accept the need for it in tough times. But unfortunately, up to now, our governments don't seem to see it that way.
Lucky there's not an election on the horizon, otherwise maybe we might see some reform. Robert, thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.